It's true we have about 2 million refugees, and that's an additional to the 4 million people who live in Lebanon. And part of that 4 million, there's also about half a million Palestinian refugees. So now it's almost more than half of the population has an official sort of a refugee status. Um, um, that crisis alone had its repercussion on the economy, had its pressure on the environment. We already have shortages of electricity, but then it was estimated that the existence of an additional 2 million people had another 10% increased demand in electricity, which we already cannot meet. The government cannot meet the demand. Looking at from that perspective, there was about an estimation of $3.3 billion environmental impact or infrastructure stress that require that much estimated amount of money to cope with that. But nevertheless, we did manage to produce an INDC. However, we took into account the status of the refugees in the sense that we hope by the time we go into the implementation of the INDC, so that's 2020 and onwards, up to 2030, that we hope that refugees would be gone back to their homeland. Even with that sort of a pressure, we did manage to produce our INDC.
Are you expecting something from the COP21 about this wave of refugee onto INDC and climate change, fight against climate change effort?
Not in particular, but then again, that is something that we had specifically mentioned in the INDC. So that goes as a disclaimer out there. I'm not quite sure there's anything being discussed specifically on refugee status. There's a loss and damage, and then we know that. There are some reports saying that the crisis in Syria, which caused the refugees to come to Lebanon, was triggered somehow by also changes in the climate. There is a link there, but I don't think the entire concept is quite advanced at this stage.
But anyway, do you think that the developed country need to take measures in order to welcome in the best way the future climate refugee? Because we all know now that there will be probably millions and millions of climate refugee in the coming years.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we could learn from this, or we could start implementing or finding ways to cope with that. If you look at the migration towards Europe, it wasn't as, it was quite drastic, but not as drastic as a single country as Lebanon had accepted. 2 million versus, I think, a couple of 100,000. And then we're talking about 50% in terms of population ratio-wise, while it's not that big when you look at the European case, but also Europe is much more advanced, GDP-wise, and so on and so forth, while we're not. But I think there are a lot of lessons learned that we could draw from now, and try to see how things could progress a bit more. A good example is the aid that has been allocated for refugees because of the refugee crisis in Lebanon that were directed towards the host communities. A lot of villages or small towns that do have refugees in their territorial in their territories have been receiving some sort of support, be that in terms of renewable, but also in adding water network to the town, so that the resiliency of the people living there increases, and then the refugee life would be a bit more easier. Nevertheless, they're still refugees. It's not an easy life. But then when the community hosting it is resilient enough, then there would not be any social problems even between the refugees and the host communities in this case.
Is that your advice to the most developed country, to be more resilient?
Well, that depends on the host community. If the host community is resilient enough, then the issue of integration comes in. But if you look at the world and you want to compare that, this case as a small lessons learned for something bigger that might come tomorrow, a lot of those countries or those potential refugees, climate refugees, would have to cross through other developing countries and not directly to the developed countries. So I think doing that, building the resiliency of first potential host communities for future climate refugees might be something that we should look at.
To conclude, at a more global level, what is Lebanon expecting from COP21?
Well, obviously we are looking for I don't want to say a deal or an agreement. That's already there, I guess. But as substance, we want to see things moving towards a trajectory where globally emissions will go down eventually towards the end of the century, and then anything that we could reduce the potential number of climate refugees would be. I mean, I wish we could go to zero. Huh? We could get to a result where there would be no climate refugees at all. But anyhow, the more we do, the more we would be able to reduce that number. And I think, though we emit only 0.07% of global emissions, that's almost nothing. We insisted on having an economy-wide target in terms of an INDC, both conditional and unconditional, just to make the point that every single country has to do something. Yeah.
Are you optimistic about this? Do you think that the biggest polluter of the world, we will not name them, but everybody knows who are they, do you think they are ready for a real agreement, for a real effort, for a real change of paradigm?
I think yes, to a certain extent. And I think it all depends on their economic preparation. For example, some countries a couple of years ago have announced their 5 or 10-year plan, and they had included a lot of renewable technology as part of their industry. So when the global movement or globally things move towards that, and the market is open, they would get the biggest share of the market. So things would move gradually, and I think that shift is about to happen.
Thank you very much for your time and for your answers.